Chapter 4. New Friends. The day after Margaret's meeting with Higgins and his daughter, Mr. Hale nervously informed his wife and daughter that he had invited Mr. Thornton to tea that night. "Mr. Thornton? And tonight? What does the man want to come here for?" Mrs. Hale said, with the expression of pain on her face that had recently become habitual. But since the invitation had been given, preparations had to be made, and Margaret spent the day ironing in the kitchen, while Dixon made cakes. When Mrs. Hale saw her daughter's tired face, she was upset. "If anyone had told me when I was Miss Beresford that a child of mine would have to work in the kitchen like a servant, preparing to entertain a tradesman—" "Oh, Mother," said Margaret, "I don't mind what kind of work I do if it's for you and Father. And poor Mr. Thornton can't help being a tradesman. With his education, I don't suppose he could do anything else." In Mr. Thornton's house, a similar yet different scene was taking place. A large-boned woman in her late 60s, with strong features and a severe expression, sat sewing in an expensively decorated dining room. She was busy mending a long tablecloth when her son entered the room. "John, I thought you were going to tea with that friend of Mr. Bell's." "I am, Mother. I've come home to change my clothes." "Change your clothes? Why should you put on your best clothes to have a cup of tea with an old clergyman?" "Mr. Hale is a gentleman, and his wife and daughter are ladies." "You have never mentioned his family before." "I have only met the daughter, and that was for half an hour." "Don't let her try to catch you, John. You're a rich man." Mr. Thornton frowned. "Mother, when I met her she treated me as if she was a queen and I was her servant. You need not worry." He left the room. "As if she was a queen and he was her servant?" Mrs. Thornton thought aloud. "Where could a woman find another man like John? He has the best heart I ever knew. I hate her." Mr. Thornton arrived at the Hales' house at exactly 7:30. Mr. Hale greeted him kindly and introduced him to his wife, whose pale face and tired manner suggested that she was not well. It was getting dark, and Margaret was lighting the lamp as he entered. Looking around the sitting-room, the mill owner was impressed by its prettiness and style. Somehow, it was much more comfortable and attractive than any of the rooms in his own large house. Margaret was serving the tea, and her movements were so graceful that at first he could not take his eyes off her. But soon he and Mr. Hale began discussing a subject that interested them both: the relationship between the mill owners and the workers. Now it was Margaret's turn to watch Mr. Thornton and notice how different he was to her father. While Mr. Hale's expression was soft and dreamy, Mr. Thornton's eyes seemed to want to enter the heart of everything he looked at. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it had the effect of sudden sunlight. Margaret liked Mr. Thornton's smile. It was the first thing she had admired in her father's new friend. "I won't deny that I am proud of belonging to a manufacturing town," said Mr. Thornton to Mr. Hale. "I would rather be a working man here than a rich man in the South, living a dull, lazy life." Hearing this, Margaret felt so angry that her face reddened. "You do not know anything about the South. There is less trade there, but there is also less suffering. I see men in the streets here who work so hard they look ill." "And may I say you do not know the North?" said Mr. Thornton gently, seeing that he had really hurt Margaret. But she did not answer, and so he continued the conversation with Mr. Hale. At the beginning of this century, the mill owners had almost unlimited power. We have much less power now. Now there are more factories, and more men are needed, so the relationship between the mill owners and the workers is more evenly balanced. One cannot say who will win the battle. "Must you call it a battle between the two classes?" asked Mr. Hale. "But it is a battle. Those who are successful work harder and behave more wisely than those who are not. And it is an unfortunate truth that lazy and foolish people will always oppose those who are successful." "If I understand you correctly, you consider all those who are not successful in the world, for whatever reason, as your enemies, then?" said Margaret, in a clear, cold voice. "As their own enemies, certainly," said Mr. Thornton quickly, hurt by the disapproval in her voice. But he felt that he should explain his meaning more clearly. He knew he could best illustrate what he wanted to say by telling them something about his own life. Feeling a little shy, so that his face went slightly red, he continued. "I say this because of my own experiences. 16 years ago, my father died in very miserable circumstances. I was taken from school and had to become a man in only a few days. Fortunately, I had a very strong and determined mother. We went to live in a small country town. There I found work in a clothes shop, and the money I earned, which was very little, had to support my mother, my sister, and myself. My mother taught me to save a little money each week, and in this way I learnt self-control. Now that I can afford to look after her in the way she deserves, I thank her silently for teaching me this valuable lesson. I believe that unsuccessful people have not bothered to learn it, and so I feel contempt for them." Margaret did not reply to this speech, and soon Mr. Thornton got up to leave. He shook hands with Mr. and Mrs. Hale, then went towards Margaret to shake hands with her too, as was the custom in Milton. But it was not the custom in the South, and Margaret just bowed, although as soon as she saw the hand half extended, then quickly withdrawn, she was sorry she had not been aware of his intention. Mr. Thornton, however, did not realize this, and walked off angrily, telling himself that she was the proudest, most unpleasant girl he had ever met. "Margaret," said Mr. Hale, after Mr. Thornton had left, "I could not help watching your face when Mr. Thornton confessed that he had been a shop boy. I was aware of it, because Mr. Bell had told me, but I half expected you to get up and leave the room." "Oh, Father, do you really think I am so silly? I liked the story of his childhood more than anything else he said. Everything else disgusted me. He was so hard. He didn't seem to realize that other people may not have received the training his mother gave him, or that it was his duty to help the less fortunate. But I did like the way he spoke about himself so simply, and with such love and respect for his mother." "I heard a lot about his early life from Mr. Bell before we came here," said Mr. Hale. and as he has told you part of it, I will tell you the rest. His father lost all his money and then killed himself. After his death, no one offered to help the family. Mr. Bell said they had very little to eat for years. But when the young man had made enough money, he visited all the people whom his father owed money to and began to pay them back. It was done very quietly, but finally he paid all his father's debts. It helped him that Mr. Bell, one of the people his father owed money to, invited him to work with him. "That was a very fine thing for Mr. Thornton to do," said Margaret. "It is such a pity, then, that wealth is the only thing that matters to him." She was getting up to leave the room as she said this, and just as she was opening the door, she said, "Father, I do think that Mr. Thornton is a very unusual man, but I don't like him at all." "And I do," said her father, laughing, "although I don't see him as a hero or anything like that. But good night, child. Your mother looks very tired tonight." Margaret had noticed her mother's unhealthy appearance in recent weeks, and it had made her anxious. Realizing from her father's remark that he had noticed it too, she felt even more fearful. There were good reasons to worry about her mother's health. Their life in Milton was so different from the way they had lived in Helston, where they had spent much of their time outside in the fresh country air. In Milton the air was heavy with factory smoke, and Mrs. Hale did not like going out much. And then there were the financial worries, and the difficulty in finding a servant. There were other signs that something was wrong. Margaret sometimes heard her mother and Dixon talking in low voices in the bedroom. Dixon would come out crying, which was the way she behaved when Mrs. Hale was very upset about something. Margaret suspected that her mother had some secret about her health that she was not telling her. That night she lay awake for hours, planning ways in which she could help. If she could find a servant to help Dixon with her duties, then Dixon could give her mother the attention she had been accustomed to all her life. Margaret spent the next few days looking for a servant, but without success. One afternoon she met Bessie Higgins in the street and stopped to talk to her. "Bessie, how are you? Better, I hope, now that it's warmer." "Better and not better, if you see what I mean." "Not exactly," said Margaret, smiling. "I'm not coughing, so I'm better in that way. But I'm tired of Milton, and I want to go to a better place." For a minute or two, Margaret did not speak. Then she said in a low voice, "Bessie, do you really wish to die?" Bessie replied, "If you'd lived the life I've lived and been as sick as I have, then you'd be glad enough when the doctor said he feared you'd never see another winter." "Why, Bessie? What kind of a life have you had?" "If you'd come to my house when you said you would, I could maybe have told you." "I have been very busy," said Margaret quietly. "But may I go home with you now?" Seeing from Margaret's soft, friendly expression that she was sincere, Bessie said, "You may come if you want." They walked together in silence until they reached a narrow, dirty street. When they entered the house, Margaret saw that a girl younger than Bessie, but taller, was washing clothes in a rough, capable way, making a lot of noise as she did so. Bessie sat down, breathless and exhausted, and closed her eyes. Margaret asked the sister, who was called Mary, to fetch a glass of water, and Bessie drank it and felt better. She asked Margaret where she had lived before Milton, and Margaret described Helston to her, doing her best to describe its beauty. "I used to think once that if I could have a day of doing nothing, a day in some quiet place like the one you described, I would feel better," Bessie said. "But now I've had so many days of doing nothing, and I'm just as tired as when I was at work. I was well until Mother died, but soon after that I got sick. It was when I began to work in a part of the factory where the air was filled with white dust from the cotton. They say the dust gets into your lungs and you start coughing blood." "But can't they do something about it?" asked Margaret, shocked. "There's a great wheel they can use to blow away the dust, but it costs a lot of money. They didn't have one at our factory." "How old are you?" asked Margaret. 19 in July." "And I too am 19. Thinking of the contrast between them, Margaret could not speak for a moment. Then, seeing that Bessie was becoming even more tired, she said, "I must go. I will come again as soon as I can. But if I don't come for a week or two, don't think I've forgotten you. I may be busy." "I know you'll come again. But remember, in a week or two, I may be dead and buried." "I'll come as soon as I can," said Margaret, holding Bessie's hand in hers for a moment. From that day, Mrs. Hale seemed to become more and more unwell. It was about 10 months now since Edith's marriage, and looking back, Margaret saw so many difficulties. But there had been moments of real pleasure, and it was a comfort to her that she and her mother were becoming closer at last. One evening, when Mr. Hale was away, Mrs. Hale began to talk about Frederick. She explained that he had taken the name of Dickinson so that he would not be recognised. She told Margaret to go to her desk and open a drawer, where she would find his letters. Margaret carried the yellow, sea-stained letters to her mother, who untied the string that held them together with trembling fingers. She gave them to Margaret to read, and at the same time told her the story of the mutiny, as she had learnt it from Frederick. Captain Reed, the captain of the Russell, Frederick's ship, had been a cruel man, who treated his men so badly that one of them had died. The men had mutinied and put Captain Reed off the Russell, sending him out in a boat with some of his officers. The boat had been found some days later by a West Indian ship. Frederick, who was one of the most senior officers, had been among those who had mutinied. Reporting the incident, the English newspapers had named him as one of those responsible for the mutiny, and said that he ought to be hung by the neck. "He fought in justice, and I am proud of him," said Mrs. Hale in a weak voice. "But I wish I could see him once more." "It is 7 years ago. Would they still hang him, Mother?" "Some of the sailors who mutinied were captured and tried in court. They were hanged. And the worst thing was that the court said that their superior officers had encouraged them to mutiny." The two women were silent for a long time. "And Frederick was in South America for several years," Yes, and now he is in Spain, somewhere near Cadiz. If he comes to England, he will be hanged. I shall never see his face again." Mrs. Hale turned her face to the wall and lay very still. Nothing could be said to comfort her. When her father came in, Margaret left the room, seeing no promise of brightness anywhere. Chapter 5. A Strike Begins. 4 or 5 days after his visit to the Hales, Mr. Thornton decided that his mother and sister should also visit them. But he had some difficulty persuading them to do so. Mrs. Thornton did not often go out visiting, and she did not understand why she should become friends with a teacher. Eventually she agreed, but it was then Fanny's turn to protest. "I am not coming," she said. "I have a headache today." "Fanny, I wish you to go," said her brother, authoritatively. "Please go without me saying any more about it." Mrs. Thornton sighed. Unlike her mother and her brother, Fanny was not a strong character, and Mrs. Thornton had an unconscious contempt for those who were weak. She behaved lovingly towards her daughter, and a stranger might have thought that she loved her more than her son. The opposite was true. The honesty with which mother and son spoke to each other showed the great respect they had for each other's strength. Mrs. Thornton thanked God for her son every day of her life. That afternoon, Mrs. Thornton and Fanny set out in their carriage for Crampton. When she entered the Hales' little sitting room, Mrs. Thornton, who was shy and hated meeting strangers, hid her shyness by looking even more severe than usual. She and Mrs. Hale started a conversation about servants, while Margaret, who was sewing, tried hard to talk to Fanny. "I see no piano, so I suppose you are not musical," said Fanny. "I am fond of good music, but I cannot play well myself. We sold our old piano when we came here." "How can you exist without one? A piano is a necessity." "You have good concerts here, I believe," said Margaret coldly. "Oh, yes, one is sure to hear the newest music here." "Do you like new music, then?" "Oh, one knows it is the fashion in London. You have been to London, of course." "Yes," said Margaret. "I lived there for several years. Have you never been there? It is an easy journey by train." "I would love to go, but Mother does not wish to. She is very proud of Milton, you see. To me it is a dirty, smoky place, but I believe she admires it for those qualities." "If it has been Mrs. Thornton's home for some years, I can understand her loving it," said Margaret in her clear voice. "May I ask what you were saying about me, Miss Hale?" asked Mrs. Thornton. Fanny replied, "Oh, Mother, we are trying to understand why you were so fond of Milton." "Thank you," said Mrs. Thornton. "I do not feel that my natural liking for the place where I was born requires an explanation." Margaret was cross that Fanny had made it seem that they had been criticising her mother. She also disliked the way Mrs. Thornton had spoken to her. After a pause, Mrs. Thornton said, "Do you know anything about Milton, Miss Hale? Have you visited our splendid factories?" "No," said Margaret honestly. I don't think I would greatly enjoy visiting such places." "No doubt," said Mrs. Thornton, sounding displeased. "I thought that as newcomers to a manufacturing town, you might have been interested in finding out more about its business." Soon after this, the visit ended. "Fanny," said her mother as they drove away, "we will be polite to these Hales, but don't become friendly with the daughter. She will do you no good. The mother looks very ill and seems a nice, quiet kind of person. Well, I suppose John will be satisfied now." The next day, Mr. Hale and Margaret returned Mrs. Thornton's visit. To their surprise, they discovered that the Thorntons lived next to their mill in Marlborough Street. Behind a long wall there was a large yard, with offices on one side and the mill on the other. At the end of the yard was a tall, attractive house. They knocked at the door and were taken upstairs to a large sitting room. Mrs. Thornton entered a few minutes later. "How is Mr. Thornton?" asked Mr. Hale. "He was unable to come for his lesson yesterday, and I was afraid he was not well." "My son is rarely ill. He told me he was too busy to visit you last night, but I know he values the hours he spends with you." "I find them equally pleasant," said Mr. Hale. "He has such an appreciation of ancient Greek literature." "I have no doubt that to know ancient Greek is desirable for those who do not work, but I advised my son not to study it. His work requires all his attention. It ought to be enough for him to have one great desire, and to aim only at that." "And that is?" asked Mr. Hale. Mrs. Thornton blushed as she answered, "To have a high position among the manufacturers in this country. My son has earned this place for himself. All over Europe the name of John Thornton of Milton is respected among businessmen." Both Mr. Hale and Margaret felt uncomfortably aware that they had never heard of this great name until Mr. Bell had told them about him. The expression on Margaret's face revealed this to the sensitive Mrs. Thornton. "You are thinking you have never heard of this wonderful son of mine, Miss Hale." "Yes, it is true. But since I have been here, I have heard enough to make me respect and admire him." Mrs. Thornton smiled, but said, "Thank you, Miss Hale. Many young women would not have said that, fearing that it would seem that they had plans to win my son's heart." On hearing this, Margaret laughed, but stopped when she saw Mrs. Thornton's annoyed look. "I'm sorry, madam, but I really am not interested in that way," she said. "Young ladies have been before now," said Mrs. Thornton stiffly. "I hope I will see Mr. Thornton on Thursday," said Mr. Hale, trying to change the subject. "I cannot say. There will almost certainly be a strike." "A strike? Why?" asked Margaret. "The workers want higher wages, I suppose," said Mr. Hale. "That is what they say, but the truth is they want to be more powerful than the mill owners. They strike every 5 or 6 years, but I believe that if the men do strike, the mill owners have some ideas that will teach them not to do it again in a hurry." That evening, Mr. Thornton came to see Mr. Hale. He was shown into the sitting room, where Margaret was reading aloud to her father and mother. "I have come partly to bring a note from my mother, and partly to apologize for not coming for my lesson yesterday. The note contains the address you asked for." "Thank you," said Margaret quickly, holding out her hand to take the note. She did not want her mother to know that her father, who was becoming worried about his wife's health, had asked Mr. Thornton to give them the name of a good doctor. Mr. Thornton seemed to understand immediately and gave her the note without another word of explanation. Mr. Hale began to talk about the strike. Mr. Thornton, looking angry, said, "Yes, the fools are going to strike. They think the cotton trade is as good as it was last year. They want better pay, but because we won't explain why we have refused their demand and tell them we may have to lower wages, they think we are trying to cheat them." "But why can't you explain your reasons?" asked Margaret. "Do you give your servants reasons for the way in which you spend your money? We manufacturers have a right to choose what we do with it." "What about the rights of the workers?" said Margaret quietly. "I'm sorry, I did not hear what you said." "I would rather not repeat it," she said. "I don't think you will understand." "Please try and explain," said Mr. Thornton, who really wanted to know what she had said. "I meant that the workers have rights too. Surely they deserve to know why you cannot pay them more." Mr. Thornton paused for a moment and then said, "In my opinion, the workers are like children. I do not think we mill owners try to keep them like that. It is just the way they are. They need to be told what to do, and, like children, they do not need to be given reasons why." Margaret replied, "I very much disagree with you. There should be friendship and cooperation between the manufacturers and their workers. We all depend on each other." The conversation continued, with neither side willing to change their position. Mr. Thornton got up to go. Margaret smiled at him, but did not put out her hand, and again as he left he told himself that she was unpleasantly proud. That night, as the Thorntons sat in their sitting room, Mrs. Thornton asked her son what he had done that day. On hearing that he had visited the Hales, Fanny said, "Are they really so different to most people one meets?" Her words annoyed her brother, but he did not reply. "They do not seem unusual to me," said Mrs. Thornton. "He appears a good kind of man, not clever enough to be in trade. The wife sees herself as a lady. The girl is the one who puzzles me. She seems to have great self-importance, and I can't understand why. They're not rich, and from what I understand, they never have been." "And she can't even play the piano, Mother," said Fanny. "Go on, Fanny. What else does she need to bring her up to your standard?" said Mr. Thornton, who was walking up and down the sitting room. Then he stopped and said bravely, "Mother, I want you to like Miss Hale." "Why?" she asked, surprised. "You're not thinking of marrying her? A girl without any money?" "She would never have me," he answered with a short laugh. "From what she told me, I don't think she would," said his mother. "Her opinion of herself is far too high to think of you." If these words hurt her son, the fading evening light hid the expression on his face, and in a minute he said cheerfully, "Well, I'm sure of that too, and have no intention of asking her to be my wife. But I see trouble for that girl. Her mother is very ill, and I would like you to be a friend to her, in case she needs one." "I cannot forgive her pride," said his mother, "but because you ask me, John, I will be her friend, if she needs it." "I am so tired of this subject," said Fanny. "Well," said her brother rather bitterly, "shall we talk about the strike then? The men at Hamper's Mill are going to strike tomorrow. Mine will strike next week." "You are going to have difficulty completing your business orders," said Mrs. Thornton, looking worried. "Can you get workers from Ireland?" "Yes, I can, and I will if the strike goes on too long. But it will make our workers very angry." He continued walking up and down the room, not speaking, but taking deep breaths from time to time. Fanny started chatting to her mother, and at 10 o'clock the family said good night. Mr. Thornton remained in the room, anxiously considering his position. Because of the strike, all his business plans were in confusion. The workers seemed to him to be completely mad. "I can give them a fortnight, no more. If they haven't understood the situation by then, I'll be forced to get workers from Ireland," he thought. In the second week of the strike, Margaret went to visit Bessie. When she arrived, Nicholas Higgins and his daughter were sitting by the fire. Nicholas, who was smoking a pipe, stood up, pushing his chair towards Margaret. She sat down and inquired about Bessie's health. "She's upset about the strike. She doesn't like it." "This is the third strike I've seen," said Bessie, sighing. "We'll win this time, you can be sure of that," said Nicholas. "Why are you striking?" asked Margaret. "There are 5 or 6 mill owners who want to pay us less than we get now," replied Nicholas. "And we won't agree. We'll die first. But don't think I'm striking just for myself. There are only 3 in my family, but John Boucher next door has a sick wife and 6 children. He can't manage with the wages he has now from the mill. How is he going to live on less?" "Perhaps you should ask the mill owners why they want to pay less. The reason may be that business is not good." "I don't believe that," said Nicholas angrily. "The mill owners will say anything. They use us so that they can get rich. But this time they'll have to give in. They've got a lot of business orders and they need us to do the work." Bessie sighed heavily when she heard this, and Margaret said, "You don't like all this struggling and fighting, do you?" "No," said Bessie. "I'm tired of it all this shouting and talk of work and wages. Oh, the tobacco smoke makes me feel ill." "Then I'll never smoke in the house again," said her father gently. "But why didn't you tell me before?" Receiving no answer, he went outside to finish his pipe, and Bessie said in a low voice, "He needs his pipe. It's one of the few comforts he has. His work is so hard and boring, and when a strike begins, everyone's so hopeful at first. And then it goes on, and people get angry and depressed." "Maybe you're exaggerating because you're not well," said Margaret. "No, I'm not exaggerating. People have been coming to see us, and they all say how much they hate the mill owners. I've seen women crying because they have no money to buy food and their children are so hungry they can't sleep at night. You're looking more and more feverish, Bessie, and your hand is so hot. Margaret found some water, wet her handkerchief, and laid it on Bessie's forehead. I must go, she said, but I'll come back soon. You're not like anyone I've ever known. I don't know what to think of you. I don't know what to think of myself. Goodbye. Bessie watched her as she walked out of the house. I wonder if there are many people like her down south. She's so strong and bright. But will she stay like that, I wonder? Chapter 6. The Shadow of Death. Dr. Donaldson, the doctor recommended by Mr. Thornton, came to call on Mrs. Hale soon after Margaret's visit to Bessie. Margaret was not allowed into the room while he was there, but Dixon was, and this made her feel very jealous. She waited anxiously outside, and when the doctor came out, she said quickly, "My father is out. Would you come downstairs?" Dr. Donaldson followed her into Mr. Hale's study. "What is the matter with Mother?" Margaret asked. The doctor hesitated, and she said, "If the news is bad, my father must be told the news gently. Only I can do this." "My dear, your mother said that you must not be told." "I feel sure that you have not promised to keep the secret." "Well," said the doctor, smiling sadly, "you are right. I did not promise. In fact, I'm afraid you will all know soon enough." Margaret went very white, but no part of her face moved. Dr. Donaldson was a man who understood people well, and he saw immediately that she was strong enough to be told the truth. He spoke 2 sentences in a low voice, watching her all the time. Her eyes grew wide, and she went even whiter. Then she said, "I have been afraid of this for many weeks." She began to cry, but a few moments later the tears stopped. "Will my mother suffer much?" she asked. He shook his head. "I can't say, but the latest discoveries of medical science can help a lot." "My father," she said, trembling all over. "He must not be told the truth yet, not all at once. It would kill him." "I do not know Mr. Hale, so it is difficult to give advice, but I will visit often, and your father will be a little more prepared for the truth. And when I come again, it will be as a friend." Margaret was crying so much that she could not speak, but she shook the doctor's hand as he left. "That's a fine girl," thought Dr. Donaldson as he sat in his carriage. "What a queen she is! The way she threw her head back, forcing me to tell her the truth. If I were 30 years younger, I would have fallen in love with her." Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her father's study, trying to find some strength. After some minutes, she ran upstairs. Her mother was lying in an armchair, looking quite peaceful. "Margaret, how strange you look. What is the matter?" Suddenly guessing the truth, Mrs. Hale said, "Dr. Donaldson hasn't been talking to you, has he, child?" "Oh, yes, Mother, he did. I made him." Margaret knelt by her mother's side and started to cry and kiss her hand. "Oh, Mother, let me be your nurse. It will be such a comfort to me." "My poor child, Dixon and I thought you should not know." "Dixon thought?" said Margaret scornfully. "I am your daughter, Mother. I only want to be near you. In Harley Street I used to cry in bed at night, thinking you would forget me. And I used to wonder, what will Margaret think of our little cottage after her luxurious life with Aunt Shaw?" "Oh, Mother, how can you say that? I loved Helston so much." "I shall never see Helston again." "But Margaret, Frederick—" Mrs. Hale started sobbing. "Frederick, Frederick, come to me. I am dying. Come to me." Dixon came running in, and they lifted Mrs. Hale into her bed. Margaret sat with her until she fell asleep. Then the two women went into the sitting room to talk. "Look what you've done to your mother. And now I suppose you'll tell your father," Dixon said angrily. "No, Dixon," said Margaret sorrowfully. "I won't tell him. He would be too upset." And she burst into tears. "Miss Margaret, my dear, I've had to keep this secret for so long, and your mother's the person I love most in the world." "Oh, Dixon," said Margaret, "I've been cross with you so often, not realizing what a terrible burden you were carrying." "You dear child. Now, you go out for a long walk and you'll feel better. I'll look after your mother." "I will." Margaret gave Dixon a kiss and left the room. Dixon watched her as she walked down the street. "She's as sweet as a nut, that girl. There are 3 people I love: her mother, Frederick, and her. Her father's always been too busy thinking and reading to look after my lady properly. And look what's happened to him. Poor child. Her clothes look old. In Helston she didn't need to mend her socks or clean her gloves. And now—" When Mr. Hale came home several hours later, he inquired anxiously about Dr. Donaldson's visit. Margaret told him that the doctor did not think her mother was seriously ill at present, but that he felt she needed care. He had given her some medicine and would visit frequently. Mr. Hale's nervous reaction showed that he realized that his wife might be in danger. All that evening, he kept going into his wife's bedroom to see if she was still asleep. Finally, he came back, looking comforted. "She's awake now, Margaret. She has asked for a cup of tea." During the next week, Mrs. Hale's health improved, and the family began to hope that she would recover. But in the streets outside, there was an atmosphere of gloom and discontent. Mr. Hale knew several workers and was depressed by their stories of hunger and suffering. When Mr. Thornton next came to visit, Mr. Hale told him these stories. The mill owner explained that in business, profits depended to some extent on the country's economy. When times were difficult, some manufacturers would lose their businesses and their workers would lose their jobs as a result. He spoke without emotion, seeming to feel that neither the employer nor the workers had a right to complain. Mr. Thornton's coldness shocked Margaret. How could he talk as if trade was the only thing that mattered? When he had arrived that afternoon, he had offered to help her mother in any way he could. Margaret could not understand how those eyes, which were so kind when he talked about her mother, could belong to the same man who spoke about his workers so pitilessly. Later that week, Margaret visited Bessie, who seemed even more exhausted than usual. The girl told her a sad story about the Boucher family next door. John Boucher, one of the strikers, had suddenly died 3 days ago. But this was not all. Mrs. Boucher was becoming more and more unwell, and the youngest child was so weak with hunger that he was likely to die. The story shocked Margaret, and she immediately took out her purse and pressed the money in it into Bessie's hand. When she returned home, she told her parents about the family, and the next day a big basket of food was sent to them. That evening, Margaret and her father went for a long walk, and as they returned home, began to discuss Mr. Thornton. "He must know how much his workers hate him," said Margaret. "They think he has no feelings." "I disagree. In my opinion, he is a passionate man, but is too proud to show his emotions." "I am not sure. But he is very clever and has great strength of character, and I am starting to like him a little." By now they were at their front door. Dixon opened it, and when they saw her face, they both started to tremble. "Thank God you've come. Dr. Donaldson is here. She's better now, but I thought she was going to die an hour ago." Mr. Hale took Margaret's arm to prevent himself from falling. "Oh, I should not have left her," cried Margaret. Dr. Donaldson met them inside. "She is better for the moment," he whispered. "For the moment? Let me go to her!" cried Mr. Hale. They entered the bedroom. Mrs. Hale lay on the bed, and from the look on her face, it was clear to them all that death was near. Mr. Hale began to shake, and Dr. Donaldson took him downstairs and helped him into a chair. After some moments, Mr. Hale said, making a great effort, "Margaret, did you know about this? It was cruel of you." "I told her not to tell you," said Dr. Donaldson. "Your wife will sleep well tonight, and will be better tomorrow, I hope." "But what about the illness? Please tell me the truth." "We cannot stop it, only delay it." Dr. Donaldson explained that they need not fear that Mrs. Hale would die immediately, but that she would not recover. He left, promising to return early in the morning. Both Mr. Hale and Dixon did not sleep for many hours. Margaret felt as if she would never sleep again. To the young woman watching by her mother's bed, her life until that moment seemed unreal. Life seemed so shadowy and passed so quickly. When the morning came, cold and grey, it seemed as if the terrible night was also a dream. It too was past. When Mrs. Hale woke the next morning, she was unaware of how ill she had been, and was rather surprised by Dr. Donaldson's early visit, and by the anxious faces of her husband and child. The doctor allowed her to return to the sitting-room, but she was uncomfortable in every position, and that night she became very feverish. The doctor thought that a water-bed might help, and suggested that the family could borrow one from the Thorntons, since he knew they had one. "I could go and ask them to lend it to us while Mother is asleep," said Margaret. That afternoon Mrs. Hale seemed much better, and Margaret left the house and set off for the Thorntons.